Welcome, Blender enthusiasts. Today, we're diving into the fundamentals of UV mapping in Blender 3D. Imagine a world where your 3D models come to life with intricate textures and lifelike details. That's the power of UV mapping, but where do you begin? Don't worry, we've got you covered. Make sure to subscribe my channel so you don't miss these amazing tutorials. Are you ready? Let's start. So I'm in the general startup file, and I've got my cube in the center. Breaking the ritual, we are not going to delete it. Any of the basic primitives, if I press Shift-A to add and mesh each of these apart from the circle, comes with a UV map. We can find that if I come down to the bottom here, under Object Data Properties UV Maps, to take a look at that map, we need to go to the UV editing workspace, and you can see that UV map just there. A UV map is all the faces of my object put into 2D. So I can now place a 2D image on my 3D object, and Blender knows how. Then to map it out onto that 3D object, the UV editing workspace puts our object into edit mode. And if I deselect all with Alt-A, my UV map disappears, and select all with A, it comes back again, and I can zoom in with my wheel to see my UV map a bit easier. So we've got the 3D viewport over the right-hand side, and we've got the UV editor on the left. If I just show you that up here, that's the UV editor, not the image editor. They look very similar, but they have slight differences. Now, in order to see the effects of this UV map, I need to put an image onto my object. Now, I can create an image within the UV editor, but it can be a little bit confusing as to what's happening if I don't also show you the shader editor. So I'm going to come to the top corner here and drag a new window out and change this to the shader editor so you can see what's happening. I don't need my tool options over here, so I'll press N to get rid of that panel and zoom in so you can see it's got a principled BSDF on my default cube over here. And I'll scroll across to the top and change it to material preview mode so we can see it turns white as my material is white over here. So I'll need to bring in an image texture node just here and plug it into my base color. So Shift-A to add texture and image texture. Bring that into the front there. But I'm not hooking it up just yet, okay? So you'll notice within the editor that I've got a new option here and an open option just as I have in the image texture node. So if I press new in here to create a new image, we can create images within Blender. I'll call it test. The pixel resolution is roughly 1,000 pixels squared. So that's how many pixels are on the image, and that would be classed as 1K image. You can obviously change these, but roughly 1,000 pixels is just fine for us. The generator type, if I click on that, we can have a blank texture, or I can change it to something like a color grid and press OK. And that looks like this. It's a grid with colors and letters to help us see where different faces are on our 2D image. Now notice, it's only in my editor. It's not within my shader editor, so we're not able to see it on my object. Also, my image texture node is still the same. I need to bring this test image into my image texture node and then hook it up in order to see the texture on my object, so I can click on the down arrow to find all the textures within Blender at the moment. And we've got this one we created here. So I'll click on test, hook it up, and it automatically uses the UVs of the cube in order to map it onto our cube, which we can see here. I'll just move the shader editor up slightly so I can zoom in on my UVs just here. And that corresponds to where the UVs are on my 3D object. Currently, if I move across my panel at the top and go to face mode, you can see the different faces as I select them in the UV editor. And when I select all you can, hopefully just about see all the faces there. So these are the different faces of the box. And you can see it's being kind of flattened out like this. If I move across the top panel in the UV editor, I can change from vertices. So currently, I can select vertices within here edges and faces. So that's F4 and F5. So if I press G to grab now in the UV editor, you can see I can now move that face and affect which numbers on my grid are being shown. It's also stretching the textures around as well. So those faces that is attached to are being stretched. I right-click to cancel that. Come around to the side so you can see that more clearly. G to grab. And you can see those other faces being stretched as the edges joining to them are being moved. So this top face, for example, which is just here, if I go to the edge and choose the very edge here, press G to grab in the X-axis and move that inwards. You can see me stretching the texture. I can make it cover more or cover less, but I'll right-click to cancel that. Incidentally, we can also scale with S and R to rotate, and that changes it accordingly. Now for this next bit, I want to show you what it looks like with an actual image on our cube. And we're going to make a house. That means you might want to download a texture. You can use any sites to download textures. Links will be in the description. For this video, I'm using Old House Textures. I can go across to my shader editor and open up an image. I have a whole folder full of textures. We can see this building that I downloaded here to make sure the name appears down the bottom here. Now, you may see the image appear in the bottom here, as this is now the main image on this object. Now, if I press Ctrl plus spacebar to make this window full screen, you can see the outline of my box once again, and it's stretched slightly to correspond to the aspect ratio of my image. The aspect ratio is the difference between the height and the width, and this is quite a long, thin image, and therefore my faces have been stretched in accordance to that, and you can kind of see how they've been stretched. If I choose this face here, you can see that it's stretched across there. It's also the wrong way round, so I'm going to have to rotate some of my faces as well. Now, one thing that's slightly confusing, if I select all and go to face mode and select this face in the UV editor and press G to grab, you can see that the faces around it that are joined to it are also being stretched. If I select just this face that makes only that face visible in the UV editor and now press G to grab it, separates it, that can be a little bit confusing. So if I select any of these individual faces, select that face, make sure you're in face mode for that, and G to grab. I can now move them into different positions, but do make sure you've just got that face selected. So I'll choose this front face here. This can be the front of the house, so I'll have this door here. I'll rotate it 90 degrees, and it's difficult to see, but I think it's actually -90. And press Enter, and then start scaling it in the X-axis. Although I don't want this top window in here, so let's scale it down just a touch more. I'm trying to keep it fairly square than ye. If I don't keep it square, you can see that it stretches my texture like this. So probably somewhere around here. What is a tiny bit confusing is that this is X and Y, and I often think this is up and therefore Z. But no, it's just X and Y for a flat image. Okay, so I've moved one into position. Let's come round to the side here. Select this one. Select the face again. -90. And I'll move this into a different position. Let's say over here scaling the X. So it's square. Bring it down and I'll scale it down a little bit more. So the top windows aren't quite in somewhere around here. And I can probably scale in the X. Just a touch does stretch it a little bit. But I think we're okay, so we can't see too much stretch there. For the top roof, if I select that, we don't really want any windows on there because that doesn't make sense. So let's scale it down and scale in the Y. So it's square, and then I can move it to a position where it's just plaster like this. I'll zoom in a bit, scale it down just a touch more, and somewhere around there. Now obviously this is covering less pixels than our side images such as this one. Here you can see that's covering a bigger area. So this one here, if I zoom into this, is a little bit more pixelated and blurry, whereas these ones are a bit more sharp. So the higher the resolution, the sharper your images are going to be in here. And the smaller area you are covering with your UVs, the more pixelated it will be because we're seeing less pixels. So let's take this face for example. I'll select the face in the image editor R-90 to rotate it around, scale it down, scale in the X to make it square. So somewhere around here. So I could press G to grab in the Y to make them a bit more aligned and scale in the Y as well, to just try and make them level some around there. Now notice that this is probably overlapping this image here, and as you can see, as I select both those, or I can select them both together, and you can see they clearly overlap, that's absolutely fine. So let's come around to the last one. Select that face R minus 90G to grab, and I'll choose this top window up here. So I'll scale it down a bit, scale in the X, move to that top window, and try and scale it so it fits roughly in line with the other ones. Not the best house, but it just about works. Okay, so hopefully you have learned the basics of UV mapping from this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to Atomium so you don't miss any upcoming tutorials. See you in the next one. Till then, keep creating.